Okay, so I've watched the first episode of The Rings of Power, and it's time to do an actual review of this train wreck. I've watched it, so you don't have to. First things first, the good, the visual effects, the locations, the CGI, the costumes, the production values. All very top-notch, very impressive, very big budget. As good as the Peter Jackson films, in my view, but putting aside all of the computer-generated eye candy, it's astounding that this series could be produced for something like $1 billion, and yet they still couldn't craft a compelling story. It's the same old situation in Hollywood over again. Great special effects, rubbish writing. It's as if they think audiences are dumb enough now that they will just accept any old excuse for a plot, so long as there's enough shiny, pretty visuals and action. And I think that's the most telling component of modern film and television, but I'll expand on that later. Amazon only has the rights to the second age of the Tolkien saga, so this series is set thousands of years before The Hobbit and the Lord of the Rings books and the Peter Jackson movies. So the series focuses on the creation of the rings, the first Dark Lord Morgoth, not the YouTube commentator from the north of England, and the fall of Númenor, along with some other important Second Age events. I don't know much about the Second Age, to be honest, but I do know that hardcore Tolkien fans are not happy that there's been some artistic license taken with the interpretation of some of the events and characters depicted in the series. Chief among them, the depiction of young Galadriel as a badass warrior, which is just cringe, to be honest. Two of the main characters you'll know if you've read the books or seen the films. They are, of course, the aforementioned Galadriel and Elrond. But I have to say, I'm not a big fan of the casting of the lady who plays Galadriel. I just don't think she's strong enough in the role, and she also does these voiceovers just like how Cate Blanchett did in the Peter Jackson movies. But Cate Blanchett has a really great and authoritative voice. This young actress, Morfydd Clark, doesn't. I don't think her voice is as strong or as interesting to listen to. Anyway, the story begins with a flashback to a young Galadriel playing by a stream with her friends, and she's made this toy boat from paper, which she believes will sail, while another kid teases her, saying that it's going to sink, and he throws a rock at it and it sinks. So she has a fight with him, and then her brother comes along and breaks it up. And this is where I very quickly got a sense of the extremely poor writing of this series. Her brother proceeds to try to teach her some inspiring wisdom with a very contrived metaphor about why a stone sinks and a boat floats in water. And it's just so bad, it's juvenile and pathetic. And what makes it worse is that the writers are trying to sound profound and deep, but it just comes off as heavy-handed, clunky, and like bad fan fiction. I won't play the whole clip for copyright reasons, obviously, but I'll read the dialogue for you. Her brother says, "Do you know why a ship floats and a stone cannot? I mean, for feck's sake. Talk about reaching to find some kind of clever metaphorical lesson. It's just so pretentious. Trying to make something benign and bloody obvious sound smart. It reminds me of that fractal neuronic cloning idea from the first season of Star Trek Picard, which the writers probably thought was really clever, but was actually painfully dumb and silly when you gave the concept any real thought. Any 3-year-old could explain why a stone doesn't float and a boat does. Try a better metaphor, please. This is lazy and forced." He says, "Because the stone sees only downward. The darkness of the water is vast and irresistible. The ship feels the darkness as well, striving moment by moment to master her and pull her under." What am I reading here? What is this mind-numbing prattle? Not everything has to be bound up in trite parables and analogies. Just get to the point. He continues, "But the ship has a secret, for unlike the stone, her gaze is not downward, but up, fixed upon the light that guides her." Bloody heck, on board already. "Whispering of grander things that darkness never knew." And she says, "But sometimes the lights that shine just as brightly reflected in the water as they do in the sky. It's hard to say which way is up and which way is down." Oh, feck. What are they talking about? You've completely lost me. I get it. This woefully ham-fisted attempt at a life lesson is going to be called back to later in the plot when she's older, right? She's going to remember this scene later in the episode, like Michael Burnham learning some lesson from her childhood with her young brother Spock, right? And then applying it to the present Because all of Hollywood is written in the same derivative and predictable manner, it's like one unimaginative trope after another. He whispers something to her, but we can't hear, and you just know that whatever he said is going to be revealed much later in the episode. So, with that introduction to just how bad and dull the writing is, Galadriel proceeds to narrate the events of the war with Morgoth, which was fought in Middle-earth. Morgoth was defeated at great cost, though his orc armies are everywhere now and under the control of Sauron. Her brother tried to kill Sauron, but died in the attempt, leaving some strange symbol on his body. So, for centuries, the elves tried to hunt down Sauron, but with no success. Galadriel continues to try to find him with a small band of soldiers, and that's where the story picks up. But her companions are growing tired of this quest, because it's dangerous, and becoming increasingly forlorn and pointless. But for some reason, she's just possessed with this need for revenge for her brother's death. Now, revenge is a very poor and simple, lazy character motivation. The problem is, this version of Galadriel is completely unrelatable, unlikable, and unpleasant. She's broody, overly emotional, quick to anger, and one-dimensional. She's not interesting, engaging, or fun to be around. She also lacks any vulnerability, any self-awareness, or self-deprecating quality. She's unreasonable and boring. So they find some castle and they fight this creature, and you can tell I was already breezing in and out with how sleep-inducing this all was. Her companion, whose name I couldn't be bothered to look up, says they have exceeded their orders months ago and they have to go home and take counsel with the High King. But she doesn't want to, but then they decide to defy her anyway, so she has to go back. Then we're introduced to the hobbit-like creatures of this era. Now, some people have made the mistake of claiming that these Harfoots are completely made up for the series because they couldn't get the rights to the hobbits. But this isn't true. The Harfoots are actually genuinely canon in Tolkien's work, and they're an offshoot of the hobbits. So we get some scenes with them, but nothing really happens, and we don't get to know any interesting characters. And this whole pattern of establishing different locations and characters, but not really achieving much by way of moving the plot forward, reminded me of the first episode of the second season of Star Trek Picard. Lots of moving around to different locations and characters, but nothing really happening in the story. Then we're introduced to the new Elrond in Lindon, which is the capital city of the elves, and he talks to Galadriel a lot. He tells her to give up this quest for Sauron and go with some of the other elves in Valinor for eternal rest, but she's not interested and she stubbornly digs in her heels. Again, the problem with how this character is written is that she has no depth and none of her motivations make sense. We don't understand why she feels so strongly about this quest. I mean, sure, she lost her brother, but everyone lost someone in the war, presumably, so what makes her so special? Halfway through the episode, Galadriel and Elrond are standing in this forest with all of these wood carvings of fallen heroes, and she tells him that she refuses to go to Valinor and that her brother's task is hers now. For some reason, she's really defensive and angry in this scene. She's very irritated and almost disgusted by what Elrond is saying to her, but he's merely trying to respectfully offer her a different perspective. He clearly cares for her, and yet she's deeply offended that he disagrees with her. Why is she so angry with Elrond? What did he do to her? Why does this character have this psycho look in her eye? Why is there such a conflict and unnecessary drama between these characters? Why can't they just have a reasonable, respectful conversation? They always have to go to this unnecessary drama and antagonism. They're supposed to be friends, but she just can't help but turn a conversation into an argument. A rather bitter one, I would add. Again, modern Hollywood writing is about as subtle and unrefined as a stone falling into water, into the great darkness, the abyss of blah blah blah. I get the overwhelming sense that there wasn't much reading of Tolkien's books, but that the producers and writers just maybe saw the Peter Jackson films and thought, well, the characters kind of speak in ye olde Shakespearean-style English, and they kind of talk in confusing riddles, so let's try and mimic that dialogue as much as possible. That'll make us sound smart. So then we're introduced to the Southlands, the lands of men where elves patrol. And we're introduced to this guy, whose name I didn't quite catch the first time around, and who I couldn't be bothered to look up. We've already talked about the diverse casting in this new Lord of the Rings series. But again, I don't know his name, so I'll just call him English Tuvok. There's a heavy-handed and not so subtle scene where he gets some racist abuse by some random angry guy in a tavern, and he calls him knife ears. Now, this is not in keeping with Tolkien. Bigotry and racial epithets and slurs don't exist in The Lord of the Rings, but of course this is modern current year television, and we're supposed to be lectured and browbeaten by this stuff at every hand's turn, it seems. So English Tuvok seems to have some romance going on with this lady, who we also know nothing about, and I can't remember her name, and they have a conversation about nothing in particular. She has a son, and there's a scene where he and a friend are in this barn, and he's teased about how his mother is involved with one of the pointy ears, again referring to English Tuvok. So again, more completely un-Tolkien writing here. And then he remarks about how maybe that's why his father ran off. Now this just plays like bad soap opera, broken homes kind of thing, like I'm watching Emmerdale or EastEnders or something. So towards the end of the episode, Galadriel is on the boat, which is bound for Valinor. She's standing there with the other elves. But right at the end, she decides not to go towards the light because, as I predicted, we get a call back to the beginning when her brother was going on and on about why stones don't float in water. And this time we hear what her brother whispered to her. He says, sometimes we cannot know until we have touched the darkness. Now, while this is happening, there's a meteor flying through the sky about to crash into the land where the Harfoots live. Now, Galadriel jumps overboard, and then at the meteor crash site, there's a man lying in the center of the crater, and the episode ends. An incredibly boring hour of television. For all of its appearances to resemble the Lord of the Rings films, it lacks the soul, heart, and fun that made them, and the books, of course, so wonderful. There were so many fun, well-rounded, likable, three-dimensional characters in the Lord of the Rings films, but in this show, there's no one that you can really enjoy spending any time with. They're all fairly wooden, or joyless, superficial, and hollow. I suppose the writing and quality of characterization is reflective of the times we live in. Modern television and film writers fail to understand the genuine deeper intent of these stories. The battles and strife of Middle-earth throughout its various ages were allegorical in nature, describing, in this fantastical world, the ongoing spiritual battle between good and evil. The Tolkien books explored themes, as I've mentioned before, heroism, duty, honor, redemption, self-sacrifice, all these things, while also providing cautionary tales of the potential for man to be corrupted by greed, power, and self-interest. It also explored man's deeper longing for something beyond the material world, a quest for the transcendent and everlasting life. J.R.R. Tolkien was a deeply spiritual intellectual and an immensely talented writer who carefully considered man's place in the universe and his relationship with nature and with the divine, and his Catholicism influenced his approach to the storytelling. I believe that in the 3 Lord of the Rings films, Peter Jackson successfully captured the themes that Tolkien was trying to convey in his books, and I think he also did a very good job with the Hobbit films as well. Because Jackson strove to keep the films as grounded in the Tolkien lore as much as possible, they are extremely authentic, which is why most Tolkien fans really like the films. But there's nothing authentic about this Rings of Power series. It's a shallow imitation of the real thing, a poor knockoff that lacks any depth, and to make matters worse, the writing and characterization is lazy and predictable, and the slow pacing makes it boring and a chore to watch. I don't care about any of the characters, and so I don't care about anything that's happening on screen. And to make matters worse, it's just not fun. That's my review of the first episode of The Rings of Power. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you'd like to support my work, you can do so from the link below to my subscribe star for as little as $1 a month. It's very much appreciated, and it helps to keep the show going. I'll catch you next time. Take care. Bye-bye.